Okay. Then we always love questions. So any questions or comments, please do not hesitate. And don't wait till the end.
When you record, is it visible again?
So I usually put it on YouTube, but I only people on they're not going to see you so I don't want to.
No, that's fine.
Yeah.
I don't care.
Yeah, we have it on YouTube, and then it's sitting there. I don't know. Yeah, it's there for the record. Could send you a link to that if you'd like.
Yeah.
Okay, we are starting a new book. So the Torah has 5 books of Moses, right? You look at Torah. In Hebrew, they call it Chamisha. Even the word Chumash, which is one way we refer to the Torah, Chumash comes from the word Chamesh, 5. And in Greek, we call it what do they call it? Pentateuch, which is 5, right? So it's divided into 5 books. So I like to think about, even I used to do this, I stopped doing this, but think about out of the 5 books of Moses, the period of time that it covers, just that you get a picture of the map of how much time, what eras is covering in history, or at least recorded history. So you think about the book of Genesis. The book of Genesis starts at the beginning, recorded history, and goes all the way to Adam, Noah, patriarchs and matriarchs of the Jewish people. Jacob is the 3rd patriarch. They have 12 sons. The sons go down to Egypt. That's the conclusion of the first book. How much time are we talking about? We're talking about almost, we're talking over 2,000 years from recorded history until the death of Joseph and his sons. And so that's you got 2,000 years, book 1. Book 2 is essentially the Jewish people's time in Egypt, slavery in Egypt, and Exodus. The story of the Exodus is important in the second book. We get the Torah after we leave Egypt, and we build the tabernacle, we build the temple for God in the desert. But that all happens within the first year after the Exodus. So if you want to talk about if the first book was more than 2,000 years, the second book is a little less than 200 years. About 183 if you want to be, 190 if you want to be precise, around 190, because the Jewish people are in Egypt for 210 years. That's the amount of time they were there. But you have to minus 17 years because the slavery took time till it started. And then the whole story is 210 years. And then you add a year for the, so it's 211 years minus 17, right? So that's what we're talking about, 90 something. That's the second book. So the first book is 2,000 years. The second book is almost 200 years. Third book is very few episodes, mostly laws. The book of Vayikra, Leviticus, a lot of the laws of the temple, laws of purity, impurity, all that kind of stuff, sacrifices. So, but the episodes, there are not many episodes. So the actual episodes that it covers is maybe a week, right? Because there's no story, it's not plot, right? So it's just laws. So that those laws could have been conveyed in a very short period of time. So maybe a week, maybe a month, not more, not longer. So we got 2,000 years, 200 years, maybe a few weeks. Third book. Fourth book, again, goes to 40 years. Well, 38 years. The 40-year period in the desert. You heard the Jewish people were wandering in the desert for 40 years, or were in the desert for 40 years after they left Egypt. So the fourth book chronicles the stories of the desert. They call it, even in Hebrew, it's called Bamidbar, which means in the desert. As opposed to in English, they call it Numbers, because in the Greek it was Numbers. But it starts with census and ends with the census. But the point, we call it Bamidbar, it's the period of time in the desert. So that's 40 years. And the last book of the Torah is basically the speech that Moshe gives before he passes away, and preparing the people for his death and for the eventual entry into the land of Israel. And we know exactly when that speech started because the Torah tells us. We know when he passed away. So it's basically 37 days. So if just to gut the 5 books of Moses, 2,000 years, a little less than 200 years, maybe a month, maybe a week, who knows, 40 years, and then 37 days. So that's just, you get the time frame, because it's all in one book, but it doesn't always color code of exactly which period we're in. So we're now shifting, and we're starting the second book. A lot changes in the second book. that's why it's a second book. So a lot changes in the second book. Just I'll give one change and then we'll read the nutshell, and then start talking about introductions. I guess the most important change is that the story of the book of Genesis, the first book, even though there's a lot of drama, a lot of nice things, and so it's very easy to get distracted, all kinds of sideshows. But if you want to say, what is the big picture? We have to advance the plot, right? What is the plot that we're trying to advance? There's subplots and there's all kinds of lessons. Every word in the Torah is a lesson. Every character in the Torah is a lesson, right? But what's the overarching story? Where are we headed? So there's different ways to read it. Everything in the Torah, there's different ways to read. So I'm not saying what I say here is the only possible interpretation. But one interpretation is we're trying to select a family or group of people that are going to get the Torah. And when you get the Torah, it's basically your responsibility to share the Torah's wisdom and values and morality with the rest of the world. So if you really think about what's happening is, God speaks to Adam, the Backel, the Noach's children, the Backel. Then we finally get Abraham, and then Abraham has a few sons. So which one is going to continue the legacy? It's a story of which child or children are going to carry the legacy of the patriarchs. And that's the tension, and that's the story. And when you finish the book, you know who it's going to be. It's going to be Jacob, and surprise, all of his children. Up to that point, it was specific children, and that was a lot of conflict. Which child is it going to be? And that explains a lot of the tension in previous stories, including the sale of Joseph. They didn't like this guy. I don't want to relitigate the whole book of Genesis, but the point is they were afraid that Joseph will be selected and they will be rejected, because up to this point, one child was selected to carry the legacy. Here, the big news is we have 12 sons of Jacob. We have 12 tribes. There's 12 ways to serve God, even within the Jewish faith. Beyond that, there's more. But there's 12 ways to do this, and it's okay. Not everybody has to be the same, and everybody connects to the same one God, even though you have your specific path. So that's the news, and that's what we achieved over the book of Genesis. Book of Exodus, we change. We're no longer talking about individuals or family. We're talking about a nation. We become a nation. The first time we're referred to as Am, as a nation, is in the book of Exodus. Interesting, it's by the Pharaoh who's oppressing us, labels us as a nation. We could talk about that. But all of a sudden, the reality is we're a nation. We're no longer individuals. Now, when you shift from a nation to individuals to nations, this creates all kinds of problems. I don't want to say problems. It's a different perspective. And then we have to manage that perspective and see what are the advantages, disadvantages, and maybe some of the at least the name of the parsha, or the name of the book, or some of the stories are helping us deal with this transition from individuals or family to nation. So that's just an introduction to the introduction. Okay. I gave two introductions. I'm sorry. I always say the old joke that where I grew up, my grandfather had a good friend, and he was a prominent member of the community. So he would always, he'd come to a bar mitzvah or a wedding, or whatever it was, they asked him to speak. And his line was always, before I start speaking, I want to say a few words. That's what he would say. So that's what I feel like sometimes. Okay, let's find the nutshell here, and then we'll be in business.
So I've had Jewish history all my life.
Yeah.
To some extent. That was unbelievably brilliant synopsis.
Yes, of the whole of the Torah. Yeah. So the timeline and okay, good. I'm glad. I always have the challenge because we're doing this for a few years, and I see people on this call that were here for many, many years, like many, over a decade. And like I'm saying, okay, so I'm repeating the old things. So I like to say something. I like to repeat things because the basic story you have to repeat. You can't, the basic story. But I also like to say something new. And if you go home and you say everything I heard was new, that's not good, because you also want to reinforce. And if you say everything I heard, I already heard, that's also a problem. So I like to give a little bit new and a little bit what you heard. So I'm already happy that I gave you something new. That's good. From here, we can only get better. Okay, let's find. In a nutshell, here we go. Okay, so I'm just going to read from the sheet of paper. It's on the screen as well. I'll read it from the screen. The name of the parsha is Shemot, which means names, and is found in Exodus 1:1. Oh, that's easy to find. Chapter 1, verse 1. It concludes chapter 6, verse 1. Okay. The children of Israel multiply in Egypt. Threatened by their growing numbers, Pharaoh enslaves them and orders the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, to kill all male babies at birth. I'm making up my own stories. I'm just misreading, so that I said as many. That would be an interesting story, but that's not the story that we have here. So it's kill all the Hebrew babies, when they do not comply, he commands his people to cast the Hebrew babies into the Nile. A child is born to Yochebed, the daughter of Levi, and her husband Amram, and placed in a basket on the river because they're afraid the child is going to be thrown into the Nile, so they can't keep him in the home, so they have to hide him. So they hide him at the river, at the reeds, the reeds next to the river. While the baby's sister, Miriam, stands watch from afar. Pharaoh's daughter discovers the boy, raises him as her son, and names him Moses. It's ironic. It is so irony on top of irony. The Nile is the place that's supposed to kill the Hebrew babies. The Nile is the place where Moshe is saved, right? Pharaoh wants to destroy the people. Pharaoh's own daughter is the one who saves Moshe, who ultimately is going to bring down Egypt. Right, so God acts in mysterious ways. Okay, so this is interesting. Okay, as a young man, Moses leaves the palace and discovers the hardship of his brethren. He sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew and kills the Egyptian. The next day, he sees two Jews fighting. When he admonishes them, they reveal his deed of the previous day, and Moses is forced to flee to Midian. There, he rescues Jethro's daughters, marries one of them, Zipporah, and becomes a shepherd of his father-in-law's flocks. So he's a shepherd in the field. He's a shepherd in the desert. He lives peace and quiet. There's no one bothering him until God comes to bother him. God appears to Moses in a burning bush at the foot of Mount Sinai and instructs him to go to Pharaoh and demand, let my people go so they may serve me. Moses' brother Aaron is appointed to serve as his spokesman. In Egypt, Moses and Aaron assemble the elders of Israel to tell them that the time of their redemption has come. The people believe, but Pharaoh refuses to let them go and even intensifies the suffering of Israel. Moses returns to God to protest. Why have you done evil to this people? God promises that the redemption is close at hand. Remember, that's not an answer to a question, right? God says, why did you make it worse? He says, ever since you sent me to the Pharaoh made it worse. God says, don't worry, you'll see the redemption will come. How that answers the question, we don't know. Maybe next week we'll see. Maybe we'll see. But that it ends sort of in its lowest point. The lowest point of slavery is the end of this week's parsha. And then it doesn't really turn till next week. So in a way, it's a dark portion, but all the ingredients for the redemption are already here. And that's maybe what we can try to show. What are the ingredients for redemption? What are the ingredients for freedom? And how they're here very early on. It may take time until they blossom and flourish, but they're here early on.
And who's Jethro?
So Jethro is just a guy in Midian. He happens to be, we know him as Moshe's father-in-law, but the Torah says Jethro, so he's a Yitro in Hebrew, he's Kohen Midian, so he's a priest of the Midianites. So he's supposed to be an important figure. And later on, he actually becomes prominent because there's an entire portion in the Torah named for him. And interestingly, in some ways the most important portion. It's the portion in this book of the book of Exodus that discusses the giving of the Torah. So you would call, it has the Ten Commandments. I would expect it to be the portion called the Ten Commandments. No, the portion is called Jethro because later, after the Jews leave Egypt, Jethro comes to the Jewish people and he comes to Moshe and he does what all fathers-in-law do, which is give advice. So he gives Moshe advice, helps them create the judicial system. So, but that's for later. The bottom line is now we know him in retrospect as Jethro. Okay, so that's the story in short. Comments, questions, please don't hesitate. Let's see where we go with this. So much to talk about. We're actually on this parsha on our Sunday track, so it's going to be. It's good to be in both places at once because on the Sunday we go very slowly. It takes us years to finish even one cycle of the Bible. It took us like 15 years or maybe a little less to finish one cycle. And then on the Tuesday track, we're doing every year. So we're moving faster. So in one sense, it's good to get the big picture when you move faster. On the other hand, it's good to drill down. So we'll try to do a little bit of each. Okay, let's talk about this, what I mentioned earlier. Let's begin with the shift from individual from family to nation. What is the danger? What is the danger of becoming a nation in general? So the danger of, I want to get political, but what's the danger of nationalism or even nationality? Okay, so what's the danger? The danger is not just that, I mean, also spiritual danger, as we'll see. The danger is that when you focus too much on the collective, then the individual is not important, right? So even to say, even in the spiritual sense, you say, imagine I'm the only person. God spoke to Abraham and says, do me a favor, move to Israel. Okay, God is speaking to you, you're going to go. But if you're one of 15 million Jews, right? So is it really important if I eat the matzah on Passover, someone else will eat the matzah? The world is not going to end right? So if once there's a collective, then the individual says, how important am I? How significant am I to God? Right? So this is a moral question. And then you also have a political question is anytime you have a nation, you have to balance the benefit of the individual versus the benefit to the community. And you have this all the time. If you open up the newspaper today or the internet today, you'll see it's happening in Israel right now, right? You have individuals who are hostages. You have to do what you can to save them. That may be jeopardizing at least to the collective, maybe not. And that's what makes it a very difficult dilemma. And thank God I'm not the one making that decision. But you see right here that the moment you have a collective, then the negotiation between the value of the individual versus the value of the collective becomes very important. And you have this in all areas. You have this politics, you have economy, you have everything, and now we're also shifting. So what I want to say is like this: if you had to choose a name for the second book of the Torah, so the Greeks did a good job. They called it Exodus because Exodus is a very nice book, very nice name. It implies freedom, implies this movement. There's a drama. If I tell you Exodus is a drama, Genesis is also a good name. Beginning. Oh, the beginning. Beginning of what? You just say that word. I really want to hear the story. So Exodus, Genesis, and Exodus are great names in Hebrew. We have Bereshit, which is Genesis, which is a wonderful name. And then when you come to the name of this book and this parsha, because the first parsha of the book, the first portion of the book has the same name of the book. Here, seemingly the Hebrews, we dropped the ball. Because in Hebrew, what is it called? It's called names. Shmot b'nei Israel. These are the names of the children of Israel who came to Egypt. And it gives a list of the 12 sons of Jacob and their families. And we, by the way, we already know that from the end of the first book, but that's a different question. Why is it repeated? But whatever the case is, it's just a bad name. I say, I want you to buy this book. It's the best book ever. What's it called? It's called Names. You say, what is this, a phone book? Why do I need to buy a phone book? Not everyone knows that. Yeah, I guess we're old enough to know what a phone book is. I don't know if my kids know what a phone book is, but the point is a phone book is a boring thing. So why are we calling this book of names, right? And instead you could have had this very, very dramatic name of Exodus. So the answer is because we look for a word that's the beginning of the book. Shmot, the second word of the portion. Shmot, these are the names. So we call it the book of names. That's the superficial answer. There's a deeper answer. The deeper answer is because names is at the heart of the tension here. So you have this in the Torah multiple times where the Torah lists names. Torah is fascinated by listing names and listing places and listing ages, which is interesting. I'm just going to take a second to talk about that. When you talk about mythology, what's most interesting, you talk about mythology at any culture. Well, how do all the stories start, and how do you know that it's a myth? Because it starts once upon a time. What does once upon a time mean? I'm not telling you what time it was. I'm not telling you what era. I'm not telling you what country. I'm not telling you who the neighbor was. I'm not telling you who his grandmother was. I'm not telling you who his wife was, who his concubine was. Doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. It's a concept. It's a parable. It's a mythology. So once upon a time, the Torah is the opposite. The Torah gives us so much information that seems to be boring. Like you really care who the 10 generations, the names from Noah to Abraham. Like you really want to, you lose sleep at night because you don't know the guy's name. If it just said there were 10 generations in Abraham, and between Noach and Abraham. You would lose any sleep? No, but the Torah tells you this was his name, this was his wife's name. Sometimes it talks about non-Jewish kings and their wives and where they came from. Like, who cares? But so there's mystical interpretations. Every word in the Torah has mystical meaning and spiritual meaning. But if you wanted to say what the Torah is doing, it's grounding it. It's not a once upon a time story. There's only one book in the Bible that starts once upon a time, and that's the book of Job. So the book starts, there was a man in the land of Uz. His name was Job. Strange. Nobody ever heard of the land of Uz. We don't know what country it is in. We don't know the neighboring countries. We don't know. Job. Who's Job? Doesn't say his father's name, doesn't say his cousin, doesn't say anything about it. And that's why, if you open up the commentaries, the Talmud itself, there's a question of who is Job? Well, we have 10 opinions. Some say maybe it was Moses, maybe it was Adam, maybe it was Abraham. And there's an opinion, maybe Job never happened. Maybe it's a parable. Why? Because it starts once upon a time, right? Because it starts once upon a time. That's just the contrast that in the Torah is obsessed with numbers and names. Okay. So in the Torah, you have that, especially in the fourth book, but also the third book. Also, it's also in the end of the first book, it counts all the people who came to Egypt. And here again, it counts all the people that came to Egypt. So the commentaries are very interested in that idea of a census, counting numbers, but also counting names, because they say Ve'ela Shmot, these are the names of the children of Israel came to Egypt. And then that verse continues. Second, excuse me, sorry. We got the book, we got the nutshell. Thank you. So Lisa used to come often, but then she moved to Israel. So now you're here. So that's a surprise. Okay. Okay, what am I saying? I'm saying numbers versus names. When you talk about numbers, what does numbers represent? Census. How many people are there in America? 300 million. When you say a number, you're not looking at every person as an individual. You're looking for what they have in common. Right? You say there are 10 apples here. You're not thinking about the difference in each apple. One's organic, one's Fuji, and one's, what else? I only eat Fujis. I don't know the other ones, Smith or whatever they are. You're not looking at the difference. You're looking at what they have in common. So numbers basically wipe out the individuality of the thing you're counting, because all you look here is the bottom line. There's 300 million people in America. How many of them are this or that? That's the number doesn't encompass that. When you say a name, you're saying the individual is important, right? You have a name. And we start the book when we talk about a nation by talking about numbers and names. And it's superfluous because we know the names. We already said it in the third book. Why in the first book? Why are you re-emphasizing it? Because specifically here, we have to say, just because we're becoming a nation, just because we have a collective, that doesn't diminish in the eyes of God and in our eyes the value of the individual. And that's why we call the book of names, because the names is the most important point here. Because it's the easiest thing is to say, we're building a collective, we don't care about the individual, right? So that is very important. And if you look at this story, but if you look at throughout this story, throughout this parsha, and maybe even throughout the book, and all the significant stories, there are stories of individual people. Moses is selected because he protects the individual person. He sees an individual person suffering, so he intervenes. Right? Some leaders, they have to worry about the collective. They can't see the individual. But that's not Moshe. That's not the book of Numbers. That's not the book of names. Maybe that's the book of Numbers. By the way, we don't call it the book of Numbers. We call it the book of deserts because, again, we say numbers. We say, in a way, we're getting philosophical. In a way, all people have a common denominator. We all have a spark of God. In that way, numbers are beautiful because it highlights the fact that we're united, that our differences are not what define us. What defines us is what we have in common. What we have in common is the spark of God. So in a way, the common denominator is something beautiful. But on the other hand, you can't forget about your individuality. God created you as an individual, and your individuality is important, and it cannot be ignored just because we have the collective. So that's the balance. When you start the book of collective, of nation, when you're moving from individual to nation, don't forget about the individual. Don't forget about your name. I'm a member of the humanity. I'm a member of the Jewish people, but I'm also my own person. So in that sense, I'm indispensable because as part of the collective, I'm dispensable because I'm only one of many. But as the individual qualities with which God created me and my individual mission, that I'm my own name. And all of a sudden, the name names is not such a boring name because it means think about the individuality of every person you see. Okay, that's already interesting. That's already inspiring. Okay, so that's introduction to the book. The question is what we're going to start with. This is my thinned out notes. So this morning I said, okay, what do I want to talk about? So I took out all the stuff that was just too long, and I thinned out notes. The problem is with thinned out notes. Problem number one is I left one of the papers at the printer, so that's okay. So we'll start paper number 2. Okay. So Elisa, could you be kind enough to pass out those books? There's one more over here. Okay, we got one more. What are we trying to show? We're trying to show that there's a statement, a Jewish statement that says as follows, very optimistic statement. It basically says that God creates the cure before there is the illness. In other words, when the problem happens, there is already a potential for the healing. But in this book, the portion starts on page 293. Thank you. 292 is Hebrew 93, and what I want to start reading, we'll read the first verse because we discussed that. And these are the names of the children of Israel who were coming to Egypt with Jacob, and it mentions that and mentions Jacob's 12 sons. And then you have the number in verse 4 and verse 5. And all the persons who emerged from Jacob's loins were 70 souls, and Joseph was in Egypt. When they came to Egypt, they came as 70 souls. From the 70, they become ultimately, after 200 years, they become a much larger group, as the Torah describes how they multiplied, etc. Okay, but what I want to look at is how maybe you have the roots of the freedom even before the freedom actually comes, which is later, you already have the roots of the freedom. So we're tracking how the slavery is intensifying, but we also have positive notes in this parsha. What are the positive notes? Birth of Moses. We know Moshe is going to be the redeemer. But there's a little story that seems to be insignificant and does not advance the plot. So why is it here? But when you look a little deeper, maybe this is the whole point, and maybe the plot cannot unfold without it. What is the story? The story is we want to get to the point where the important part of the plot is that Pharaoh decrees that all of the Hebrew males should be thrown into the Nile. That's where we have to get to, right? Everyone knows that story, I think. That's what we have to get to. It's even in the nutshell. Before that, we read of the story that a story doesn't advance the plot. What happened? I'm reading from the nutshell here. Pharaoh, the second line, ordered the Hebrew midwives, Shifra and Puah, to kill all male babies at birth. When they do not comply, he commands his people to cast the Hebrew babies into the Nile. Why is it so important, this whole story of Shifra and Puah? Why is it important? It doesn't do anything. He thinks that he tried to kill the Jews this way. It didn't work, so he found another way. So why do I have to talk about the first way, right? It's not, if it's in the premise is if it's in the Torah, it's significant and it's important. Okay, so let me just share the screen here so we can read it on the screen, and the people who want to see it inside, because not everybody has the book. And then we'll read it quickly, and we'll see maybe there's some reading, right? So I'm reading. Okay, I'm reading on chapter 1, verse 15. So in the art scroll in this blue book, it's on page 295, and it's verse 15. Okay, so I'm going to read it. I'm going to read it from the screen, so it's a little bit different, but you get the point. It's verse 15. The king of Egypt spoke to the Hebrew midwives, one of whom was called Shifra, and the other was called Puah. He said to them, when you deliver the Hebrew woman, look at the birth stool. If it is a boy, kill him. If it is a girl, let her live. But the midwives feared God, and they did not do as the king of Egypt had told them. They helped the boys live. And then they could keep reading. I'm turning the page here because here it's a different screen. The king of Egypt summoned the midwives and demanded of them, why have you done this and kept the boys alive? The midwives answered Pharaoh, because the Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are skilled in giving birth. Before the midwife gets to them, they have already given birth. God dealt kindly with the midwives. The people continued to increase and grew very strong. Because the midwives feared God, he granted them dynasties. So obviously this plan didn't work. So verse 22, here at the artbook page 297, Pharaoh commanded his entire people, saying, every son that will be born into the river shall you throw him, and every daughter shall you keep alive. So if the premise is that we don't want to speak extra, we don't want to say anything that's not important, it does not advance the plot. So I ask you, who needs this little episode of verse 15 to verse 21? Who needs it? Like, why is that important? You want to get to the story that Pharaoh said to throw all the babies into the Nile. And that's why Moshe, when his mother had a baby, she couldn't keep him because then the Egyptians would find him. So she puts him next to the Nile. And that's why the Pharaoh's daughter finds him, et cetera, et cetera. The story unfolds. Okay. So why is that important? So one interpretation, which I think is nice, well, you could say maybe the dynasties to explain the later dynasties within the Jewish people. So one interesting thing is that the Torah says, Shifra and Puah, the commentaries explain, we give that two names, Shifra and Puah. That's on page 295 in verse 15, right? Shifra and Puah. So Rashi already tells us that Shifra and Puah are not their actual names, probably not their actual names, but rather they are the sort of professional names. Shifra and Puah is the names because based on what it's based on the profession. So I'm going to open Rashi here on the screen. Here I have Rashi, and I'll read it. Where's Rashi? Okay, Shifra and Puah. I'm reading Rashi. Shifra, says Rashi, this was Yocheved. Yocheved is Moses' mother, known as Shifra because she would improve Mishaperet, the physical condition of the newborn. Puah, this was Miriam, known as Puah, Moses' sister, known as Puah because she used to call out, Po'ah, speak, and croon to the newborn in the way women soothe crying babies. Puah is an expression of crying out, as in, he quotes a verse, like a woman in labor, I will cry out. That's a verse from the Bible somewhere from Isaiah. What's happening here? First thing that's happening here is, so there's technicality, and so where do the commentaries get this from? So Rashi quotes the Medrash. Rashi says, when you say Shifra and Puah, it happens to be Moses' mother and Moses' sister. Once you say it's Moses' mother and sister, we're getting closer. So maybe it is important to understand who Moses was to understand who his mother and sister were, right? So maybe that's important. I just want to say something. Where does Rashi pull this out of the hat? Like, where does he get Shifra Puah as Yocheved and Miriam? Like, where did that happen? So we have this whole thing. Shifra means you're making the child more beautiful, and Puah means speaking to the child, meaning it's the professional name. It's what they're required to do as opposed to their name. But where does he get this from? So one way to look at it is the Bible, like I mentioned earlier, the Bible almost always, when it gives you names, when it gives a name, it doesn't give a name just once. Usually, always, it gives a name and it's going to be referred back to, or the name has a context. Who was this person? Who was the parents? Who was the child? Almost nowhere is there a name like this out of the blue. Shifra, Puah, no context. And therefore, it happens other times, but it's not common. And therefore, whenever this happens, the rabbis always try to say, maybe these are people that we know about. Because if they're not known about, why are we mentioning them? Because it's not the pattern of the Bible just to give a name out of context, drop a name, no parent, no child, no one, we never hear from them again. It doesn't happen. So we like to say, maybe it's another name. Maybe it's a synonym for somebody in the area on these pages. We mentioned Jethro. In the Torah, there's no less than 7 names for Jethro. And it has to be the same person because Moshe only has one wife and only one father-in-law, right? But it says sometimes they're called Reuel, sometimes Chovav, sometimes Kani, sometimes Yitro. And we'll say each one represents something in his personality. But that's an example where when you hear a random name, and there it's clear because the Torah actually says so, it's clear. But when you hear a one-time name, you want to group it in together with somebody you already know. So that's what's happening here. So what's happening here is Shifra Puah. The next page, we're going to hear about Moshe's mother, and we're going to hear about Moshe's sister, because it says Moshe's sister is going to watch and see what happens with the baby Moshe in the Nile, in the basket next to the Nile, right? So we know these people are coming up. So the rabbis say, you know what? It's the same guy or the same girl, same people. Okay. So what does this happen? Why is this important to the plot? That was my underlying question. And the answer is, and this answer comes up throughout the entire book. What is freedom? And how do you give people freedom? And the answer is, you can't give people freedom, ever. You can't teach people to be free. We tried to do it in Iraq. Doesn't work. You can't spread democracy. You can't spread. The people, freedom is the ability to defy the oppressor. It's not the lack of oppressor. Because if you don't have an oppressor, right? If the oppressor puts me in jail, And then he says, I command you to leave jail. And I left jail. So am I really free? No. Yesterday I listened to him. He told me to go to jail. Now I listen to him because he told me to leave jail. The freedom means to defy the oppressor. That's what freedom is. And that's why the fact that Moshe's mother and sister can get up and say, they're defying Pharaoh. Pharaoh is the king of the superpower of the time. And to a little girl, she's 6 years old, and her mother, slaves, could defy the Pharaoh. That's the family where freedom is going to come from.
And that's what we see later when they leave and
Oh,
say,
very good. Very good. What's the big question? Go ahead. Keep going. Keep going.
so they don't leave the way Pharaoh wants them to leave. They have to stand up to Pharaoh.
Oh, so there's a lot. So even let's go even before that. It happens. Sorry, they come to Pharaoh. Moshe comes to Pharaoh. We know what Moshe. God puts this in his mouth. I know what he says. Let my people go. Okay, everyone knows that verse. 3 days, so they can serve me in the desert. All they asked for is 3 days, and the whole 10 plagues that you heard of, and Pharaoh let him go. It was all for 3 days. They basically lied. They never said we're coming back, but they never said we're not coming back. And that's what happens after they leave Egypt. 3 days pass. So Pharaoh says, okay, now we have to just expect them to come back. They move slow because there's a lot of people, women, children, cattle. So it takes 3 days to walk. So we'll wait 3 days till they come back. 3 days later, they didn't come back. So what does Pharaoh do? We have to go chase them. And that's the showdown at the Yam Suf, at the Sea of Reeds. And that's where the splitting of the sea happens. But this whole story happened because the Jewish people asked for 3 days. Now the question is, why do you ask for 3 days? Why couldn't you ask, we want to go free forever? So one answer could be because Pharaoh would never let. But Pharaoh would let because he had no choice, because we broke him, because there's the 10 plagues, and the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn, and he himself was the firstborn. So you have a gun to his head. When you have a gun to Pharaoh's head, it seems much more efficient to say, let us out for good. And Pharaoh would have to sign off on that. Instead, you say, let us out for 3 days. And then the Pharaoh's going to come and chase you. Missed opportunity, right? 3 days later, 6 days later, Pharaoh's like, okay, it wasn't so bad. The plagues weren't so bad. We're going to go chase them. What's happening here? And it's the same idea. To be able to be free. If Pharaoh says go free, we're not a free people. We can only be free if we're escaping the Pharaoh, if we're defying Pharaoh. And the people know Pharaoh's going to chase us. He's got the strongest army in the world. He'll chase us. Doesn't matter. We'll figure it out. But we're not turning around. The freedom does not happen when Pharaoh says leave. The freedom happens 3 days later when they don't turn around. Right? And that's consistent throughout the entire story. At least it's also mentioning that they also the way that they travel, this affects everything in the story, but it's a very important concept. You cannot be given freedom, you have to take it. And the taking it is defiance. And now when you have that concept, because you heard it later in the Parsha with asking for 3 days, now you come back and you say, is this a trivial story or is this a critical story about Moshe's mother and sister? Maybe it's a critical story. You can't have a Moshe. Where did Moshe come from? How does this guy, how do you get it? Nobody does this. Nobody gets up and defies a king, period, end of story. Certainly not the Pharaoh, certainly not the superpower. How does Moshe do it? So you could say, well, he grew up as a prince, so the prince is just trying to rebel. Okay, it's just, but maybe the answer is because he gets it from his family, and in his family they have freedom, and this person is truly free. You could subjugate them physically, but you can't break their spirit. Their spirit was never broken. And that's the story. So you're stronger than me. You can force me into slavery, but I'm always a free person, and that's why I'm not afraid to defy you. And that's the moment. They never, at least that family, maybe not the rest of the Jewish people, but at least this family, the tribe of Levi, they were never really fully in the slave mentality, and that's why Moshe could get the people out of Egypt, and that's why his mother and sister could defy, and that's where you have to look for freedom. So that's just a little bit, sort of a big picture about the Parsha, about the big story, because it's a big theme that keeps popping up throughout the portion and throughout the book. So that's a good thing to think about. Okay. Another thing we want to talk about, running out of time, another thing we want to talk about is maybe the fascinating story how Moshe was born and named. And this we talked about on Sundays, so I'll try to do it quickly, because on one hand, I said it in the past, so many people already heard it, but on the other hand, it's too beautiful not to say. So I cannot resist, I have to say it. So if you look at page 297, chapter 2, that's the story of Moshe's birth. And so here you say, I'll just read it quickly. A man went from the house of Levi, and he took the daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and gave birth to a son. She saw that he was good, and she hid him for 3 months. She could not hide him any longer, so she took for him a wicker basket and smeared it with clay and pitch. She placed the boy into it and placed it among the reeds at the bank of the river. His sister stationed herself at a distance to know what will be done with him. Pharaoh's daughter went down to bathe at the river, and her maidens walked along the river. She saw the basket among the reeds, and she sent her maidservant, and she took it. She opened it and saw the boy, and behold, a youth was crying. She took pity on him, and she said, "This is the one of the Hebrew boys." Obviously, a kid left at the Nile. She figured he must be a Hebrew. Okay. What happens next? His sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and summon for you a wet nurse from the Hebrew woman who will nurse the boy for you?" The daughter of Pharaoh said, "Go." The girl went and summoned the boy's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this boy and nurse him for me, and I will give you pay." So the woman took the boy and nursed him. The boy grew up, and so that's another irony. So Pharaoh's daughter is telling the mother to nurse, right? Even though Pharaoh's household is trying to destroy the children. The boy, verse 10, the boy grew up, and she brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh, and he was a son to her. She called his name Moses, as she said, "For I drew him from the water." We want to talk about that because Moshe is a very important figure in the Bible, and understanding what his name was and what his name was not is important. Go ahead, Dr. Tamarin, please.
Question. Do the commentators say anything about why Pharaoh's daughter would defy him? She knew what the rules were, and yet she somehow made a choice of her own to do something out of her own feeling of compassion for this child, which violated her father, risking the fact that her father might be furious at her.
Right. So maybe another woman in Moshe's life who defies the Pharaoh. So both his birth mother and his biological mother were two examples of women who did not necessarily agree with the oppressor, and showed him the example. So where does Moshe come from? So he doesn't come out of thin air, right? Now the verse of Vayigdal Hayaled, verse 10, the boy grew up, and she brought him to the daughter of Pharaoh. How old was he when his mother brought him back to his stepmother? I don't know. It says Vayigdal, he grew up. In the Torah, Vayigdal could be stop nursing. It could be 2 months old. It could be 13. It could be all kinds of things depending on the context. So it's not clear. I don't know how old he was. Okay. But at some point, the point is, it says he grew up. So he was grown. In some sense, he was grown, right? So I would imagine that he recognized both these women, both his mother and both the daughter of Pharaoh. And both his mother and his biological mother, Hebrew biological mother, and his Egyptian adopted mother, both of them are people who are not who defy the Pharaoh. It's fascinating. It's unusual, but it does help explain where Moses emerges from. Right. So it's not just his sister and his mother, but it's also his stepmother, or that's what you call a stepmother, adopted mother, yeah. Okay, so I don't have an answer to your question, Dr. John. I just know that the results speak for themselves. How did she do it? I don't know, but I know what she did.
But I'm wondering whether the commentators, so let's talk about the role of women in the Bible. And let's talk about the fact that Moses wouldn't have even existed. And that everything that unfolded would not have happened without these two women. And the commentators, who are always looking beyond the surface, must say an enormous amount about these two women as making it possible for Jews to exist.
Yeah, I mean, in the modern world, people get offended if you start talking about roles of genders. I don't know what. I do tell you that in Judaism, at least for the past more than 2,000 years, maybe more, Judaism is basically passed on through the mother.
Mm-hmm.
Even though what tribe you are follows your father. But whether or not you're Jewish follows your mother. So why is that? So that itself is a testament to personality is affected by the mother. So your father, at least in the ancient world, your father basically affects your role in the world. Are you going to be a priest? Are you going to be a farmer? Are you going to trade? Are you going to do agriculture? Are you going to raise cattle? Right? What tribe you are. So that's occupation. Now, in America, we like to conflict. We define ourselves by our occupation. Who are you? I'm a lawyer. I never asked you what you did. I said, who are you? But you tell me your occupation. That's part of the modern world, right? But in more simple times, in biblical times, what I do is who I am for the outside world. It's not who I am. I come home. Who am I? So my mother defines or shapes who I am. My father teaches me how to make it in the world, but that's not who I am, right? So that's the way they saw it in the past. Maybe today it's not divided exactly in that way, but in the past that's the way they saw it. So if you're gonna say the making of Moses, who shapes Moses? There's no male figure that shapes Moses. In fact, the father is not even mentioned. You know what it says about the father? Now we know who Moshe's father is because in the next portion it tells us his name. You know what Moshe's father's name in this week's parsha is? Nothing. A man went from the house of Levi and took the daughter of Levi. A man. We don't even give him a name. Maybe that's telling us that the man is not important. Well, the mother doesn't say the name. So there's a commentary that says as follows: why doesn't it tell us the name of Moses' father and mother? It tells it to us later, but not now, because if it tells us the name, it happened to be that Moses' both his parents were from the tribe of Levi, which was a prominent tribe, a spiritual tribe. If they told Torah introduced Moses by first telling you who his mother and his father is. So when you're in a situation like Moses, when you see someone getting oppressed, you're going to say, I'm not stepping in for that person. I cannot defend the weak. I'm not Moses. Why are you not Moses? Moses had prominent parents. Moses came from a prominent tribe. So by not telling you who Moshe's mother and father are, the Torah is telling you who's Moshe, what are his credentials? Nothing because of his nature. Anyone could be it. Just do what he did. You could become that too. Right? So by omitting his parents' name in the beginning, and only giving it later, it says, yes, his parents were prominent people, but that's not the factor that influenced him. What is the factor who influenced him? People who were not afraid, the women who were not afraid to defy the Pharaoh. And what characteristic that defines who Moshe is, that we'll see in the future stories. And I want to make mention of it, even though people have heard this before. Basically, what are the credentials of Moshe? Moshe, in a way, in Judaism, is the most humblest of men and the greatest prophet. We could talk about how those two are interlinked. The bottom line is none of this information comes out in the beginning. We hear he's the humblest of men in the 4th book of the Torah. We hear that no other prophet was as great as Moses on the final page of the Torah, right? So that's not why if he was chosen because he's handsome, it would have said he's handsome. If he's chosen because he's humble, it would have said he's humble. If he's chosen because he's good looking, he would say he's good looking. If he's chosen because he's a great prophet, it would have said that. It doesn't say anything. It doesn't say why he was chosen. So why was he chosen? What were his credentials? So the only thing we could look at is what are the stories that the Torah tells us about Moshe before he was chosen, before God comes to him. And there are 3 stories. And they're very different in some ways, but they have a common thread. And what they have in common is Moshe stands up for the oppressed. He sees Egyptian hitting a Jew, he steps in. He sees a Jew hitting Jew, he steps in. Then he goes to Midian and he sees the male shepherds oppressing the daughters of Jethro. Jethro had no sons, so his daughters were the shepherds. The men didn't like it that the women are becoming the shepherds because they're infringing on their livelihood. So they oppressed them. They didn't let them feed water. Moshe comes and saves Jethro's daughters and gives their flock water. So what do these 3 things have in common? That Moshe is somebody who, when he sees injustice, he steps in. That's all you have to be a Moses. You don't have to be Moshe. You don't have to be the son of Amram, who happened to be a prominent person. You can be that too, but that's not the defining factor, because if that would be, the Torah would mention his name. Torah doesn't mention his name, right? And if you want to get specific, and I say this every year as well, so I'll say it again, if you look at these stories, they actually, each one is on a greater level. It's relatively easy to protect a member of your group against someone from a different group. We're almost we're almost primed to that by evolution, right? So we have our group, the other group's attacking. We're going to solidify. We're going to protect each other. So what's the first story? Moshe considers the Hebrews his brothers, which is a fascinating part of the story. But the bottom line is, it says he goes out to see his brethren, so he considers himself as part of the Hebrew group. An Egyptian is attacking a Hebrew. Oh, you're going to mess with my brother? I'm going to step in. The next story is more complicated. 2 Hebrews fighting. And the Jews, we will defend each other from the outside, but Jews fighting is it's all the time. It's been happening ever since the book of Exodus. It's still going on, right? Because there's no incentive to protect your group against the other group. So within your group, you can kill each other. And Moshe doesn't say, oh, 2 Jews are fighting, who cares? No, Moshe steps in with 2 Jews. That's harder to do than protecting a member of you, right? If someone attacks my sibling, I'm going to step in. If my 2 siblings are fighting, I will go good, whatever. So not always am I going to step in. The greatest feat is the third story. First story is he comes to a strange place, a stranger oppressing a stranger. Like you just showed up to town. What are you getting involved? You're an immigrant. You just walked in. You just showed up. Literally, you just showed up at the desert. You just showed up. You showed up at the well. You showed up at the airport. Why are you getting involved? There's two strangers. Let them deal with it. But Moshe in all these three stories, and it increases in the difficulty, right? Relative difficulty. So he's advancing. His character is developing. But on the other hand, what they all have in common is he's going to stand up for the oppressed. And then God says, and then when we hear that in chapter 3, God appears to him in the burning bush and says, "Go and take my people out of Egypt. They're being oppressed." We know why God chose Moshe, because Moshe doesn't tolerate this. Moshe responds to this. It's actually interesting that I don't want to get too detailed, but next week we hear about the other side of the story. God once again tells Moshe, "Go take the people out of Egypt." You know why? Because I have a promise to their ancestors and a covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I'm going to bring them to the land of Israel. All kinds of beautiful things. But that's said in step 2. That's not said in step 1, because Moshe doesn't respond to that. Moshe responds to the oppression. When he sees someone who is oppressed, that's where Moshe responds. So God comes to Moshe. You want to influence somebody. You speak to them. What is going to move them? So God says, "I heard the oppression of my people. Pharaoh's oppressing them." Moshe responds. That's not the only reason why he's taking us out of Egypt. There's really 2 reasons. One, because we're being oppressed and God cares for the oppressed. Number 2, because God has to keep the promise to the patriarchs, which is to take us out of Egypt and bring us back to Israel. But it's interesting that in the first conversation with Moshe, there's nothing about covenant, nothing about patriarchs, nothing about promised land, nothing about becoming, none of that. It's just a basic story, which repeats over history many times, where the oppressed, where you have to defend the oppressed, and God is with the oppressed. And later, there's an additional layer. But that's not the first. That doesn't speak to Moshe. That doesn't motivate Moshe right away. What motivates Moshe, step 1, is oppression, and Moshe cannot tolerate oppression. That's what we see. So we all can be a Moshe in some sense, and that's the final point that I want to make if we have time. Go ahead, Doctor.
The question is this: what Moshe's do? What I'm wondering whether this is a common theme in Torah and in Judaism, that we assess people not by what they say, but what they do, and that in fact, it doesn't even say so much that we're reaching the conclusion. For example, the reason that basically a wife was selected for Isaac was not because of anything she said, because they observed her and how she was responding.
Act of kindness.
Yeah, so in a sense, is this a theme throughout Judaism that we assess people by what they do?
I think you're right. I think you're right. I haven't thought about it in those terms, but I think you're right. I'm not a scholar, but just
you are a scholar. Come on.
I'm a student in the Torah. In Judaism, there's no word for a scholar. How do you say a scholar in Judaism? Talmid Chacham, which is the greatest thing you can become, is a Talmid Chacham. What's Talmid Chacham? So there's 2 ways to read it: either a wise student or the student of the wise. But the bottom line is you're always a student. You're never a scholar. You're always a student. Even the scholar is the student of the wise, or a wise student, because you always have to learn more. But my point is, I think in philosophy, in how people understand history, there's 2 schools. One school of thought is you want to look at people's intentions. What do they really want? And sometimes you could say, well, they had a good intention, but it didn't really work out, so something else came out, right? So you basically evaluate history by what they did, separate from what they said they're going to do, what they intended to do. Then I believe there's another school that says we're not interested in what they think, because their intention is proved by the actions. So a person can say, I really intended to be a nice guy. I ended up burning up the building because of external circumstances. That's one school of thought. The other school of thought is the action proves your intention. Your intention is not interesting. So I think that what you're saying, Doctor, is talking about kindness is not interesting. If you fed the woman, the guest, and you fed the camels and you gave them water, then we know you're kind. Otherwise, maybe you wrote a book about kindness, maybe you wrote a movie about kindness, but it's much less interesting. Go ahead, Vicky, please.
Thank you, Rabbi. Continue the theme about the qualities of a leader. Is there anywhere else that it says that compassion is an important quality for the leader?
Compassion. The Torah does say, the Medrash does say that just like Moshe, you want to look for patterns. And I mentioned this on Sunday, either this Sunday or the other Sunday, because I remember Dr. Taran asked the question about this, about bringing animals to camp. the Medrash does make the point, the patterns, that Moshe was a shepherd, selected from being a shepherd, and King David is a shepherd, selected from being a shepherd. He got his job as being Saul's warrior from being a shepherd. And it's this pattern is too obvious to ignore. So the Medrash makes the point that God tests the leader with sheep, because if you're a shepherd, that occupation, we're not talking about mass producing agriculture, not agriculture, cattle like we do today. Shepherd means you are kind. Either you were kind or you became kind by your occupation, right? I don't know what affected what. You're kind, you chose the occupation because you were kind, or you weren't kind, but you spent your days and years caring for animals, so you become kind. So that which way it happens is not important, because both of those can happen. And King David, talking about a warrior, talking about a leader, we're talking about, especially in the ancient world, what do you want to highlight? You highlight what we might. You highlight the strength. That's what's attractive in a leader. And here we're saying, what was his credentials? He was a good shepherd. If you're a good shepherd, you can be a good king, then you can be a good warrior. How does that work? Because again, the idea we started with is a concept of you're the king of the commonwealth. You're the king of the whole nation. But if you don't know if you can't feel the pain of an individual, then you're in the wrong business. Because because the collective doesn't allow us to forget about the individual.
Midrash about him chasing after the lion.
Yeah, both Moshe and most of the Medrash, it's not really clearly in the story, but the Medrash says he came to the mountain of God in the burning bush. The Medrash says, how did he get to the burning bush? Because one sheep ran away from the flock, and he chased that sheep, and that's where he got to the burning bush. So the whole revelation that he gets is only after he demonstrates concern for the individual. But again, that's a Medrash about Moshe. But you see the pattern. The pattern is interesting. Both Moshe and David, and there may be other examples that I'm forgetting right now. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that's the story in short, because it's 1:01. I apologize for finishing 2 minutes late. Therefore, anyone who wants to go can go. Anyone who wants to stay and ask questions, that we could be here all day. But everybody's free to go. Thank you all for coming in person and online. See you next week in good health.
Rabbi, is the new course being given Sunday at the time of the Sunday meeting?
Yes.
So the new course starts on Sunday.
Yes. Yeah. So it's not this Sunday. It's a Sunday. What is it? February 2nd or whatever.
So this Sunday is the regular Sunday.
Regular. Yeah.
And then the second will be the new course.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay.
Thank you.
So there were different